Hello and welcome to Indus News live from Islamabad. I am Muneeb Hamid with the news of this hour. Let's begin with the headlines first. India's coronavirus cases have jumped to nearly 4.4 million, with almost 90,000 people tested positive, while over 1,100 died overnight. In Pakistan, 9 people have lost their lives to the virus overnight, taking the death toll to 6,359, with more than 299,000 cases. Globally, the virus has claimed over 897,000 lives, while infecting over 27.5 million. Meanwhile, leading pharmaceutical company AstraZeneca has halted last-stage trial of its vaccine after an unexplained illness in a study participant. Two members of Myanmar's military have confessed to Rohingya genocide in the International Criminal Court. In a statement, the international rights group Fortify Rights said the two soldiers admitted to killing some 180 Muslims and burying them in mass graves. The group said their senior commanders ordered them to kill all Rohingya Muslims in September 2017. China says the United States is trying to incite instability with proposed orders to block imports from Xinjiang region over alleged human rights violations. At a press briefing, the Foreign Ministry spokesman Zhao Lijian said Washington has no right to intervene in China's internal affairs. U.S. Customs and Border Protection officials have prepared orders to block imports of cotton and tomato products from Xinjiang. News coming in detail after a short break. Stay tuned. Welcome back. Now let's have the news in detail. India's coronavirus cases have jumped to nearly 4.4 million as almost 90,000 people tested positive, while more than 1,100 died overnight. Globally, the virus has claimed over 896,000 lives, while infecting over 27.4 million. More details in this report.
Hopes of battling the COVID-19 monster anytime soon have been dampened, at least for the western part of the globe. Leading vaccine candidate of the West, AstraZeneca has suspended its phase 3 trials after a volunteer fell ill. But the company says this does not mean the vaccine is off the table. While President Donald Trump promises Americans a cure sooner than they think, the second wave of the virus continues to wreak havoc in India while the country slips deeper into economic strife. Criticism of Prime Minister Narendra Modi grows in the country as starvation pushes people to borrow at hefty interest rates from private lenders.
We lost all work, my husband and everyone else's husband as well. Modi shut down all the means of employment because of this disease, but he can't shut down the hunger, of course. So we took money from Praya's group and started carrying the earning responsibility of the family. My husband was a little unwell, so I had to work.
Greece has joined the list of European countries where the second wave of COVID-19 is now getting a foothold. Australia's sigh of relief over a decline in the cases has been short-lived as new infections spike once again in the lockdown state of Victoria. State's premier has been facing severe criticism over the extension of restrictions and arrests of those who have been violating them.
We'd all like to be open tomorrow, myself included. But to do that is not an act of leadership. That is to cave to some of the pressure that's there, to be driven by the anger instead of the epidemiology, to be driven by opinion instead of science and data and doctors.
South Korea's defiant churches are facing backlash for flouting retractions and becoming hotspots for cluster infections. Meanwhile, Egypt has lifted some travel restrictions and resumed flights to and from Moscow.
Meanwhile, in Pakistan, 9 people have died from COVID-19, while 426 tested positive for the virus in the last 24 hours. The Health Ministry says the country's death toll is at 6,359. The ministry said over 286,000 patients have recovered so far. It said the number of active cases has declined to 6,794. The ministry said the countrywide caseload is over 299,000. Sindh remains the most affected province with over 130,000 infections, while Punjab has reported more than 97,000 cases so far. Now, Pakistan says the United Nations Human Rights Office has documented a worsening situation in Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir in the last 1 year. In a series of tweets, Pakistani mission to the United Nations said an OIC contact group in Geneva briefed the UN Human Rights Commissioner on the latest situation in the occupied valley during an online meeting. They say the contact group urged the UN Commissioner to continue monitoring human rights violations in the territory. Last year, India illegally revoked the special status of the occupied Kashmir in violation of the UN Security Council resolutions and imposed a curfew. Since then, Indian occupation troops have killed over 300 Kashmiris and arrested dozens of politicians. Moving on, 2 members of Myanmar's military have confessed to Rohingya genocide in the International Criminal Court. In a statement, the international rights group Fortify Rights said the 2 soldiers admitted to killing some 180 Muslims and burying them in mass graves. The troop says their senior commanders ordered them to kill all Rohingya Muslims in September 2017. The soldiers have provided the names of 17 direct perpetrators from the army, including a lieutenant colonel, a colonel and 3 captains. They claim these officials ordered or contributed to atrocities against Rohingya in the Rakhine State. Fortify Rights said this is the first time ever that the perpetrators from Myanmar could be tried at the International Criminal Court. The group said these 2 soldiers may become insider witnesses. Now, the Arab League foreign ministers are holding a virtual meeting today to discuss the recent UAE-Israel normalization deal. The Palestinian Authority will chair the emergency meeting. The authority is set to introduce a draft resolution calling on all member states to remain committed to the 2002 Arab Peace Initiative. Earlier, President Mahmoud Abbas termed the deal of Abu Dhabi's betrayal to the Palestinian cause. The Arab coalition says the fighting in Yemen says it has downed an explosive-laden drone over the Abha airport in Saudi Arabia's Asir province. State media said the drone was aimed at civilians in the kingdom's southern area before being shot down. Claiming responsibility, Houthi spokesman Yahya Sarrier said the drones targeted Saudi military and sensitive objects in the airport. The Saudi-led coalition has been at war with the Houthi rebels who ousted the Yemeni government in Sana'a in 2015. Now, at least 37 million people have been displaced by the U.S. war on terror that began at the start of this century. A report by the Costs of War Project says the estimate is conservative and the real total could be far higher. This report has more.
Brown University's Watson Institute of International and Public Affairs estimates that between 48 and 59 million people were displaced by the U.S. global war on terror. The report focuses on 8 conflict zones including Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Yemen, Somalia and the Philippines. The report says in Pakistan, some 3.7 million people were displaced, while about 5.3 million people were uprooted in Afghanistan. It says Libya saw at least 1.2 million displacements in what the IDMC called a state collapse triggered mass displacement. Iraq has the largest number, with 9.2 million people displaced by several wars, with the data only focused on just 5 provinces. In Somalia, some 4.2 million were forced to move, and Yemen recorded 4.4 million displacements as a result of direct U.S. operations. The Philippines, the only Southeast Asian country on the list, saw 1.7 million people forced to migrate internally. The report says although 25.3 million people have returned, that does not erase the trauma of displacement.
Now, Afghanistan's first Vice President Amrullah Saleh has narrowly dodged death after his convoy was bombed in the capital Kabul. In a statement, his spokesman said Afghanistan's enemy once again tried to harm Saleh but failed. He said Saleh was on his way to office when the explosion occurred in the Taimani area of the capital. Police say 10 people were killed and 16 others wounded in the attack. No group has yet claimed responsibility. Now, we are joined by regional political analyst Rahimullah Yousafzai. Now, Mr. Rahimullah, today's Afghanistan's first Vice President Amrullah Saleh survived a bomb attack in the capital, Kabul. So do you think it was an attempt to sabotage the already delayed intra-Afghan negotiations?
It has been 6 months or more than 6 months when the US-Taliban peace agreement was signed in Doha. And, the exchange of prisoners and the inter-Afghan dialogue was supposed to start in 10 days on 10th March. It didn't happen. So there has already been a delay, and the Ashraf Ghani government, of which Amrullah Saleh is a part, it has been involved in delaying tactics. And that is also one reason that the talks have been delayed. But let me tell you that Amrullah Saleh remained the head of the Afghan intelligence NDS. He has been a politician. He has been attacked in the past as well. So I think that, he is a target.
Right, Mr. Rahimullah, what could be the future consequences of this latest attack in the Afghan capital?
I think it will create uncertainty. It will create concern regarding the, protection, safety of other leaders. I think they will now restrict their movement. They will become more careful. But I think that at this stage, the Afghan government or the Taliban should not further delay the peace talks, because the peace talks are meant to stop these kind of incidents, to make Afghanistan peaceful again. So if they don't talk, if there are no peace talks, and if there is more violence, then I think that these kind of incidents will continue. There will be target killings, there will be assassinations. That's why it's very important to sustain the peace process. And for that, I think some of the important stakeholders, like the Afghan government, the US, Taliban, even Qatar as the host of the Taliban Political Commission and the host of the peace talks, they all have to play a role to try to, bring peace and to facilitate the peace talks. I think that, it's a shared responsibility. No one country can do this, and they have to join hands and, try to ensure that the peace process, the peace talks begin as soon as possible, because the U.S. election is upon us. And the result, the outcome of the U.S. presidential election will also negatively or positively impact the Afghan peace process. So I think before the election on November 3, there should be at least some progress in the peace talks.
Absolutely. We hope Afghanistan finds peace very soon. Rahimullah Yousafzai, sir, thank you very much for your time. Now, moving on, France has told its businesses to prepare for the risks of a no-deal Brexit. This comes after London hinted at not implementing some parts of the Brexit deal agreed with the European Union. The French junior trade minister Franck Riester said trade companies in the country need to be ready in case of Brexit agreement is voided by London's actions. Riester said Paris needs to make sure that our British partners respect their commitments. Meanwhile, the EU chief negotiator Michel Barnier has arrived in London for crunch talks with the UK to broker a post-Brexit trade deal. Britain will set out new details of blueprint for life outside the European Union in today's meeting. More news coming up in this bulletin after a short break. Stay tuned. Welcome back now. China says the United States is trying to incite instability with proposed orders to block imports from the Xinjiang region over alleged human rights violations. At a press briefing, the Foreign Ministry spokesman Zhao Lijian said Washington has no right to intervene in China's internal affairs. Zhao said the decision is also a pretext to oppress Chinese customers. United States Customs and Border Protection officials have prepared orders to block imports of cotton and tomato products from Xinjiang. The group of 7 countries has condemned the alleged poisoning of Kremlin critic Alexei Navalny. In a statement, the G7 foreign ministers called on Russia to apprehend the people responsible for poisoning. The G7 statement said the use of any sort of chemical weapon is intolerable under any circumstances. It said Navalny was surely poisoned after a Berlin hospital found traces of a Soviet-style Novichok nerve agent in his blood. Russia denies Germany's claim, saying there is no evidence of the alleged poisoning. Navalny was airlifted to Germany after falling ill on a Russian domestic flight last month. Now, Belarus's embattled President Alexander Lukashenko has hinted at fresh polls amid ongoing protests over the disputed election. In an interview, Lukashenko said he may have been in power for too long. However, he is ready to reform the constitution. Lukashenko refuses to hold talks with the Opposition Coordination Council amid calls from the EU for a political dialogue. Meanwhile, the exiled opposition leader Sviatlana Tikhanovskaya has called for international sanctions against the Minsk regime. Virtually addressing the Council of Europe, Tikhanovskaya said the regime is violating international norms and human rights. At least 7,000 protesters have been arrested in demonstrations calling for Lukashenko's resignation after 26 years in power. Moving on, British police have charged a man with 1 count of murder and 7 counts of attempted murder. Police arrested Zephaniah McLeod on suspicion of murder after the series of stabbings in the central city of Birmingham. In a statement, the Crown Prosecution Service said the man was charged after considering the evidence amid an ongoing investigation. The detectives said the stabbings were not linked to terrorism. A man died after being stabbed on Sunday, while a man and a woman are hospitalized in critical condition. The United States Treasury Department has blacklisted 2 former Lebanese ministers over their alleged ties to Hezbollah. It accused the 2 of providing material and financial help to Hezbollah. In a statement, the Treasury Secretary Stephen Mnuchin said Hezbollah has exploited the Lebanese political system to spread its malign influence. Mnuchin said corruption has run rampant in Lebanon and that the U.S. stands with these people in their calls for reforms. Lebanon has been reeling from its worst financial crisis, and in the latest blow, a massive blast ripped through the port in Beirut last month, destroying the country's main grain silo. Now, fires have broken out at a refugee camp on Greece's island of Lesbos, forcing thousands to flee. The facility was placed under quarantine last week after 35 COVID-19 cases were reported in the asylum seekers. There have been no reports of casualties. Officials' initial reports suggest fires broke out at different locations. A government spokesman says the cause of the arson is under investigation and a state of emergency will be declared across the island. The Moria facility has been frequently criticized by aid groups for poor living conditions. It hosts some 12,000 people, more than 4 times its capacity. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has warned that humanity will be doomed if the world powers are not united to curb climate change. In an interview, Guterres said countries must retool their economies for a green future. He called for the nations to use the pandemic as a springboard to launch transformational measures to wean societies off fossil fuels. Guterres said the government must invest in renewables and commit to net zero carbon emissions by 2050. Record floods in Sudan have threatened sites housing the royal pyramids of Mirieh and Nuri. The Interior Ministry says 102 people have died in the floods, while tens of thousands of houses have been destroyed. The rise in groundwater has jeopardized the country's archaeological site, some 350 kilometers from the capital, Khartoum. Head of the Museums Authority, Hatim Al-Noor, says the teams have been working to protect the site from being swamped. The Nuri pyramids include the tomb of the Hadka, who ruled over lands in modern-day Sudan and Egypt in the 7th century BC. Residents of the flooded area say they fear worse is yet to come. Now, Iran and Turkey have discussed ways to materialize $30 billion of trade exchanges earlier agreed by both sides. Foreign Minister Javad Zarif says the two states had productive discussions in the 6th Iran-Turkey High-Level Cooperation Council meeting. Zarif said Iranian President Hassan Rouhani and his Turkish counterpart Recep Tayyip Erdogan co-chaired the council meeting virtually. He said the leaders discussed cooperation in the energy, transportation and tourism sectors. An official said the two sides also mulled over ways to help establish peace in Syria. He said other regional issues, including the Palestine cause and the hostile behavior of some states, were also on the agenda. Now, Euro stocks have edged up with the European Union and the UK set to negotiate the post-Brexit trade agreement. European stock 600 is trading 0.5% higher. London's FTSE 100 has gained over 0.5%, while Frankfurt's DAX has climbed almost 1%. CAC 40 in Paris too has edged up fractionally. Earlier, markets in Asia-Pacific declined following tumbling Wall Street shares after the leading COVID-19 vaccine trials hit a snag. And now let's have a look at the weather updates across the globe. Well, that is all for now. For the latest updates, you can follow us on social media at Indus.News. Take care.